I still remember the exact words because they didn't sound angry. They sounded settled. "You're not invited to my wedding, Dad. Emily and I agreed it would be less complicated if you stayed away." I stared at my phone, reading the text again, while the coffee in my kitchen went cold. After 68 years, I thought I understood the difference between temporary pain and permanent damage. That message was the second kind. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't call relatives to plead my case or post anything online. Instead, I quietly called my attorney the following Monday and changed my $87 million estate plan. At the time, I believed I was simply protecting myself from one more heartbreak. I had no idea that the decision would expose a secret my daughter had been hiding for nearly 3 years, or that it would save everything my late wife and I had spent 4 decades building. My name is Richard Bennett. I'm 68 years old, retired now though. I spent most of my life running a commercial roofing company outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody ever thanked us for replacing the roof on a warehouse in July when the asphalt felt like it could melt your boots, but the company paid well because we did the jobs other people avoided. By the time I sold the business at 65, I had more money than I ever expected to see. Between the company's sale, investments, rental properties, and the house my wife, Margaret, and I had lived in for 36 years, my estate was worth around $87 million. If you'd met me at the grocery store, you never would have it. I still drove a 6-year-old pickup truck. I clipped coupons, I mowed my own lawn. Margaret used to joke that I'd denegotiate with a vending machine if it charged an extra quarter. She wasn't entirely wrong. Margaret had been the generous one, I was the careful one. Together we somehow found the right balance. She passed away from pancreatic cancer 5 years before all of this happened. Losing her changed the rhythm of every day. People tell you grief gets easier. In my experience, it simply becomes more familiar. You learn where it sits inside you. Sometimes it's quiet for weeks. Then you hear an old song in the hardware store, and suddenly you're standing in the paint aisle pretending to compare brushes because your eyes won't stop watering. Margaret and I had one child, our daughter Caroline. For most of her life, I believed we'd done a decent job raising her. She was bright, ambitious, and funny in the dry, understated way her mother had been. She graduated near the top of her class, earned an MBA, and eventually became a marketing executive for a healthcare company in Chicago. I couldn't have been prouder. After Margaret died, Caroline called almost every Sunday. Sometimes we'd talk for 10 minutes. Sometimes for an hour. She'd ask how the tomatoes were growing or whether I'd finally fixed the porch railing I'd been ignoring for months. She'd laugh at my terrible jokes because Margaret wasn't around to roll her eyes anymore. Those calls kept me going. Looking back now, I realized they also kept me from noticing what was slowly changing. The first sign was so small it barely registered. About 18 months after Margaret's funeral, Caroline mentioned she'd started dating someone named Emily. "I think you'd like her," she said. "What does she do?" "Corporate strategy. I don't even know what that means," she laughed. "Neither does Grandpa." That was the Caroline I knew. Easy, relaxed, comfortable. A few months later, she brought Emily to Columbus for Thanksgiving. Emily was intelligent, polished, and confident without appearing arrogant. She remembered people's names, asked thoughtful questions, and insisted on helping with dishes, even though she clearly had no idea where anything belonged in my kitchen. When they left that weekend, I told Margaret's photograph sitting on the mantel something I hadn't expected to say. I think she found a good one. For a while, everything seemed normal. Birthdays, Christmas phone calls, weekend visits. Then almost so gradually I couldn't pinpoint when it started, something shifted. Caroline stopped calling every Sunday. Then every other Sunday. Eventually I'd go 3 weeks without hearing from her. Whenever I called, she sounded distracted. "Sorry, Dad, things are just crazy at work." I understood. Or at least I thought I did. Then she stopped staying at my house during visits. Instead, she'd book a downtown hotel. "It makes it easier," she explained. "Easier for what? We've got friends to see." I didn't push. People in their 30s have busy lives, at least that's what I kept telling myself. The following spring, I invited them over for dinner. Emily smiled politely. "We already have plans. No alternative date, no rain check. Just plans." It stung more than I wanted to admit. Still, I reminded myself that disappointment isn't evidence. Families go through seasons. Not every quiet period means something is broken. Around that time, my financial advisor, Michael Harris, suggested we review my estate plan. "It's been almost 6 years since Margaret passed," he said during our annual meeting. "Tax laws have changed. Your investments have changed. It wouldn't hurt to make sure everything still reflects your wishes." "My wishes haven't changed." "They rarely do," he replied. "But circumstances sometimes do." I nodded and scheduled the appointment with my attorney for the following month. At that point, I had absolutely no intention of changing beneficiaries. Everything was straightforward. Caroline would inherit nearly everything. A few charitable gifts Margaret had requested. Some money for scholarships at the local trade school. The rest belonged to our daughter. That had always been the plan. Then came Father's Day. I drove to Chicago because Caroline had insisted she couldn't get away that weekend. When I arrived at her condominium building carrying homemade peach pie, one she'd loved since she was 12. Concierge looked confused. Are you here for the engagement brunch? I blinked. He immediately looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, sir. I thought before he could finish the elevator doors opened. Caroline stepped into the lobby wearing a cream-colored dress. Emily walked beside her. Behind them came nearly 20 smiling friends carrying flowers, champagne, and wrapped gifts. Someone yelled. Congratulations again, everyone applauded. My daughter froze the moment she saw me. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then she walked over with a smile that looked painfully forced. Dad, you got engaged? Her eyes dropped to the pie in my hands. We were going to tell you. I looked around the lobby filled with celebrating guests. It seems like you already told everyone else. She reached for my arm. It's not what it looks like. I wanted to believe her. More than anything, I wanted an explanation that made sense. Instead, I noticed something small. Emily wasn't looking embarrassed. She was watching Caroline, almost as if waiting to see whether she'd follow through with something they'd already discussed. That feeling stayed with me all the way back to Ohio. At the time, I couldn't explain why. Months later, I would realize that Father's Day wasn't when I lost my daughter. It was simply the first day I caught a glimpse of it. For the next several weeks, I convinced myself I was overthinking everything. People announce engagements in different ways. Young couples have friends, coworkers, social circles. I wasn't part of. Maybe Caroline had simply handled things awkwardly. Maybe she had been waiting for the right moment to tell me. I wanted that explanation to be true. When you've spent your life believing the best about someone, your mind works overtime to protect that belief. 3 days later, she finally called. I'm sorry about Sunday, she said before I could speak. I was surprised. I know. I just wish I'd heard it from you. You were going to. I looked out my kitchen window at Margaret's rosebush. I'd managed to keep them alive after all these years, though they never bloomed quite as brightly without her tending them. When she hesitated, we hadn't figured that part out yet. That answer bothered me more than I expected. Not because it was dishonest, because it sounded rehearsed. I changed the subject. When's the wedding? Probably next spring. Big ceremony. We're still deciding. I'd be happy to help however you need. Another pause. We'll let you know. It wasn't what she said. It was how carefully she chose every word. The conversation ended after less than 10 minutes. When I hung up, the silence in my house felt heavier than usual. A month passed, then another. I heard almost nothing about the wedding. No discussion about venues, no opinions about flowers, no stories about cake tastings or photographers. Every engaged couple I'd ever known talked endlessly about wedding plans. Caroline barely mentioned hers. Whenever I asked, she answered politely but vaguely, we're still working things out. It's coming together. We're keeping it simple. Eventually, I stopped asking. I told myself she'd share details when she was ready. Instead, I learned about them from someone else, my younger sister Linda. She called one evening sounding excited. I got my invitation today. You did? It's beautiful. I'm glad you haven't received yours yet. I tried to keep my voice steady. Not yet. I'm sure it's coming. I'm sure. After we hung up, I checked my mailbox again. Nothing. The next afternoon, nothing. By the end of the week, still nothing. I even wondered if it had been lost. That seemed more likely than believing my own daughter had forgotten to invite me. Then another relative called. Then another. Everyone had received invitations. Everyone except me. I stared at my phone for nearly an hour before sending a simple message. I think my invitation may have gotten lost in the mail. Her reply came almost immediately. Can we talk tomorrow? My stomach tightened. People rarely schedule conversations that carry good news. The following evening, she called exactly at 7. She sounded nervous. Dad, did my invitation get lost? No, the word landed with surprising calm. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I don't understand. Emily's voice echoed faintly in the background before disappearing again. Caroline took a slow breath. We decided not to invite you. I waited. Surely there had to be more. Instead, she continued. We think it will create less tension. Tension with who? There are people who have opinions. What people? Our friends, our coworkers, I frowned. What opinions? They think. She stopped. Think what? They think the age difference between you and Mom made people uncomfortable. I almost laughed. Margaret had been 4 years younger than me. 4, not 20, not 34. That doesn't even make sense, I know. Then why would it matter? They also think. Another pause. My chest felt strangely tight. Just say it. They think you're intimidating. I looked around my empty kitchen. There was an old Labrador asleep by the refrigerator. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the table. Bird feeders hanging outside the window. If this was intimidation, the birds certainly hadn't noticed. I've met your friends twice, I know, so how exactly am I intimidating? They think you're controlling because you're wealthy. I sat down slowly. I finally understood. None of this had anything to do with me. It had to do with assumptions, stories, ideas built by people who'd never bothered to know me. I've never controlled you with money. You haven't. I've never told you who to date. No, I've never threatened to cut you off. No, then, why are we having this conversation? She didn't answer. Sometimes silence tells you more than words ever could. What does Emily think? I finally asked. Another long pause. We made the decision together. It sounded practiced again, carefully polished, almost memorized. I see. I hope someday you'll understand. I hope so too. Then came the sentence that replayed in my mind hundreds of times afterward. It's just one day, Dad. One day. As if weddings existed in isolation. As if they weren't declarations about who belonged in your life. As if excluding a parent was comparable to changing a seating chart. I kept my voice calm. If that's truly what you both want, it is. Then I won't argue. She sounded relieved. Thank you for understanding. Understanding, that word lingered after we hung up. Because I understood far more than she realized. I understood that somewhere along the way my daughter had stopped worrying about hurting me. The following Monday, I drove downtown to meet my attorney, Daniel Foster. His office overlooked the river. Margaret and I had sat in those same leather chairs nearly 15 years earlier when we'd written our first comprehensive estate plan. Daniel greeted me warmly. Good to see you, Richard. I wish it were under happier circumstances. He noticed immediately. Everything all right? No. We sat down, he waited. One thing I appreciated about Daniel was that he never rushed silence. Eventually I explained what had happened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty sympathy. When I finished, he folded his hands. So you're considering changing your estate plan? I think I have to. Out of anger, I answered without hesitation. No. Out of punishment? No. Then why? I looked toward the window. Because I may have misunderstood what family means to my daughter. He nodded slowly. That's a very different reason. I slid a folder across his desk. Inside was every current document. Wills, trusts, property schedules, investment summaries. Daniel studied them quietly. This is a substantial estate, I know. If you make major changes now, they should reflect thoughtful planning, not temporary emotion. They will. He leaned back. What are you thinking? I surprised even myself with the answer. I don't want to disinherit Carolyn. He raised an eyebrow. But I don't want to reward indifference either. So what's your goal? I want my money to protect the values Margaret and I spend our lives building. He smiled slightly. Now we're talking about legacy instead of revenge. Exactly. That was the difference. I wasn't trying to hurt my daughter. I was trying to make sure everything Margaret and I had built would outlive us with purpose. Daniel picked up his pen. Let's explore some options. At that moment, I believed I was simply rewriting paperwork. I had no idea that one small question Daniel asked before the meeting ended would uncover a trail of financial decisions and hidden conversations. It would change the way I saw my daughter forever. Daniel closed the folder and reached for a yellow legal pad. Before we change anything, he said, I want to ask you a question. I ask every client making a significant revision. I nodded. If something happened to you tonight, would you feel confident that every person you've named in your current estate plan is capable of protecting what you've built? I answered almost automatically. Yes. Then I stopped, because for the first time in years I wasn't certain. Daniel noticed your thinking. I am. What changed? I leaned back in the chair. My daughter never cared much about money growing up. That's usually a good sign. It was Margaret and I made sure she understood the value of earning things. She had chores, a summer job, student loans. She insisted on paying herself. We were proud of that. So your concern isn't about Caroline? I don't know anymore. He folded his hands. Then perhaps the better question is whether circumstances around her have changed. That sentence stayed with me. Circumstances around her, not necessarily Caroline herself. As we reviewed my assets, Daniel paused at one of the rental properties. This apartment building still generates solid income. It does. And you've kept every property debt-free. I hate owing money. He smiled. I know. Then he looked at another document. I also noticed you've never added Carolyn as a cooner on any accounts or properties. No good. I looked at him. Why good? Because it's remarkably common for parents with significant estates to begin transferring ownership late in life. I've had people suggest it. What did they say? Avoid probate, save taxes, make things easier later. Daniel nodded. I hear those phrases every week. And they're not always given for the right reasons. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. That afternoon, I stopped by my bank to renew a certificate of deposit that had matured. The branch manager, Karen Ellis, greeted me by name. I'd banked there for over 30 years. As she processed the paperwork, she looked at her screen. Everything else still looks good. What do you mean? Just reviewing your profile. She hesitated, then frowned slightly. Actually, it's probably nothing. What is it? She turned the monitor slightly in it. Enough for me to read it, but enough that I could see several notes attached to my account. You've had 3 separate inquiries over the past 8 months regarding your estate accounts. I blinked. Inquiries from who? I can't disclose names. Were they authorized? No. My stomach tightened. What exactly were they asking? She chose her words carefully. General questions about transfer procedures, beneficiary designations, account accessibility. When she read the dates, one was 6 months earlier, another 4 months earlier. The most recent only 5 weeks ago. I never made those calls. I know. Were they family? I truly can't answer that, but someone was asking about my estate. Yes. And they weren't authorized. No. Karen looked genuinely uncomfortable. I only mentioned it because you've always been careful about financial security. I thanked her and finished the paperwork. The drive home felt longer than usual. who asks about someone else's estate while they're still alive. And why I told myself there had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe someone had called the wrong account. Maybe an assistant at one of my investment firms. Maybe an administrative mistake. Still 3 inquiries over 8 months that didn't feel accidental. That evening, I called Michael Harris, my financial advisor. Have there been any unusual requests regarding my portfolio? He didn't answer immediately. What prompted that question? I explained what Karen had told me. Michael became very quiet. Richard, what I didn't think much of it at the time. There was a call last winter. I gripped the phone tighter. What kind of call? A woman identifying herself as someone helping organize your financial affairs. I never asked anyone to do that. I know what does she want. General information. Did you give it? Absolutely not. Did she identify herself? She said she was acting on behalf of family. My heart sank. Did she mention Carolyn? No Emily? No anyone? No, then why didn't you tell me? Because I assumed it was a scam. He sighed. Looking back, maybe I should have. After we hung up, I opened a notebook I kept in the kitchen. Margaret used to call it my thinking book whenever something didn't make sense. I'd write down facts instead of emotions. Facts were easier to trust. I wrote 3 estate inquiries, 1 investment inquiry, unknown woman. Not authorized then. I added something else. Timing begins shortly after engagement. I stared at the page. Maybe it meant nothing, but maybe it didn't. The following weekend, my sister Linda stopped by with homemade cinnamon bread. She took one look at me. You've lost weight and fine. No, you're thinking. Apparently everyone who knew me could recognize the signs. Over coffee, I finally told her about the wedding. She covered her mouth. She actually said you weren't invited. I nodded. Linda shook her head slowly. Richard, this doesn't sound like Carolyn. I've been telling myself the same thing, so what changed? I don't know. She looked toward the framed family photographs on my bookshelf. One picture showed Caroline at age 9 proudly holding the blue ribbon shed won at the county science fair. Margaret stood beside her laughing. I'd taken that picture. Linda smiled sadly. Your sister-in-law adored that little girl. I know if Margaret were here, if thought about that every day. Linda stirred her coffee. You know what your wife would tell you? I smiled faintly. Probably. Find out what's true before deciding what's to do. That sounded exactly like Margaret. She never reacted to rumors, never assumed motives. Never confused feelings with facts. By the time Linda left, ID made a decision. No more guessing, no more trying to read between the lines. If something was wrong, I wanted evidence. Monday morning, I called Daniel again. I'd like to move forward with the will, yes, and one more thing. I'm listening. I want every document reviewed. How thoroughly? Everything trusts, everything property titles, everything powers of attorney, everything. He paused. You suspect something. I don't know if I do, but you want certainty. Exactly. Daniel agreed to begin immediately. 3 days later, he called back. His voice was calm, professional, but different. Richard, I've found something you need to see. What is it? I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. My pulse quickened. Is it serious? Another pause. Let's just say whoever has been asking questions about your estate wasn't asking random questions. I felt a chill run through me. What did you find? I've compared several public records, and they suggest someone has been preparing for your assets long before anyone had reason to believe you'd be leaving them. I stared out the window at Margaret's roses swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. For the first time since Carolyn excluded me from her wedding, I wasn't thinking about hurt. I was thinking about intent, and I had the uneasy feeling that whatever Daniel was about to show me would prove this had never been about one wedding invitation at all. I barely slept the night before my meeting with Daniel. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind wandered back to that text message. You're not invited to my wedding. At first I thought those words were the wound. Now they felt more like the warning. By 9 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting across from Daniel in his office. He had a thick file on his desk with several sticky notes marking different pages. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he slid a legal pad toward me. I want to make something clear before we begin. I nodded. Nothing. I'm about to show you proves criminal conduct. So why do I feel like I'm about to hear something terrible? Because it demonstrates planning. I frowned. Planning for what? He folded his hands. For a future in which your estate was expected to become available. The words settled heavily between us. Daniel opened the file. After your call, I reviewed more than your estate documents. You said you checked public records. I did. He turned the first page toward me. It was a copy of an LLC registration from Illinois. A perfectly ordinary business filing until I saw one name, Emily Harper. The same Emily? Yes, I don't understand. You will. He pointed to another section. The company was formed about 14 months ago, so it has no employees, no revenue, no obvious business activity. I looked up. Lots of companies never get off the ground. That's true. He slid over another document. This company, however, listed anticipated capitalization of $5 million. I blinked. $5 million, yes, for a business with no income. I stared at the paperwork. Where would someone expect that kind of money to come from? Daniel didn't answer. He simply let the question remain in the room. The next document was stranger. It wasn't financial. It was real estate. Emily and Caroline had recently purchased a large parcel of land outside Chicago. Nearly 20 acres. The purchase itself wasn't remarkable. The financing was. They only made a small down payment, Daniel explained. The loan officer noted expected future liquidity. What does that mean? It usually means the borrowers anticipated a significant increase in available assets. When within approximately 2 years I looked at him, that's oddly specific. I leaned back. Could they have expected bonuses, possibly investment returns, also possible? But lenders generally don't accept vague optimism. They want documentation, so someone gave them confidence. He nodded once. Apparently I rubbed my forehead. This still doesn't involve me. No, but the timing is uncomfortable. Everything had begun after the engagement. The unanswered financial inquiries, the distance, the sudden secrecy, the property purchase individually, none of it meant much. Together, it painted a picture I didn't like. Daniel reached for another folder. This next item concerns me more. Inside were printed screenshots from social media. Most were harmless. Engagement photos, vacation pictures, dinner parties. Then one image caught my attention. Carolyn and Emily stood in front of the empty land they'd purchased. Both were smiling. One of Emily's friends had commented, "Can't wait to see the dream house once everything finally comes through." Emily had replied with a smiling emoji. Another friend wrote, "It's all happening faster than expected." Again, a smiling emoji. Nothing illegal, nothing explicit, but something about it unsettled me. People often reveal more in casual moments than formal conversations. Daniel closed the folder. "I'm not accusing anyone I know. But you're wondering, yes. So, and my silence filled the office. Finally, I asked the question neither of us wanted to voice. Do you think they expected to inherit soon?" Daniel answered carefully. "I think someone appeared remarkably confident that substantial assets would become available. But I'm healthy. I exercise. Yes, my doctors are happy with every checkup. I've seen nothing suggesting otherwise, so why would anyone plan around my estate?" I don't know, that honest answer somehow frightened me more than speculation would have. Driving home, I found myself replaying conversations from the past 2 years. Little things I'd ignored, Emily asking detailed questions about my rental properties. Caroline casually wondering whether I'd ever considered simplifying my finances. Questions about trusts, questions about taxes, questions about whether maintaining multiple properties had become too much work. At the time they'd sounded like concern. Now I wasn't so sure. That evening I opened one of Margaret's old journals, not because I expected answers. Because reading her handwriting always helped me think clearly. She'd written something years earlier after we'd helped an elderly neighbor recover from financial fraud. The people closest to us deserve trust. But trust survives only when it welcomes honesty. I read the sentence 3 times. Margaret had never believed trust meant avoiding uncomfortable conversations. Real trust welcomed them. Maybe I'd spent too long avoiding one. The following afternoon, my phone rang. It was Carolyn. For the first time in weeks, her voice sounded cheerful. "Hi, Dad. Hello, I wanted to check on you. I'm doing fine. Good." There was an awkward pause, then she laughed softly. "So I heard you met with your attorney." My grip tightened around the phone. "I did. Linda mentioned it." That surprised me. My sister hadn't known why I'd gone. Only that I'd met with Daniel, so... "Oh, nothing." Her tone was light, almost too light. "I was just curious about what... If you were updating everything, why would that interest you?" She hesitated. "I don't know." Then she changed the subject, almost immediately. "Anyway, wedding planning has been stressful," I answered politely. "I'm sure it is." She talked another few minutes before ending the call. Afterward, I sat motionless in my chair. Out of everything we could have discussed, the first thing she asked about was my attorney. Not how I was feeling, not whether I was hurt, not whether we could fix what had happened. My attorney. The next morning, Daniel called again. "I've spoken with your accountant, all right?" He reminded me of something. I'd forgotten. "What about 18 months ago Carolyn requested copies of your historical gift records?" I frowned. "I don't remember authorizing that. You didn't. Did she receive them?" "No." "Why was she asking?" "She told your accountant she was helping organize your long-term planning." My heart sank. "I never asked her to do that, I know. And she never mentioned it to me." "No." I walked slowly to the kitchen window. Outside, the first leaves of autumn were beginning to change color. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary, yet underneath that ordinary surface, a pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone had been gathering information about my finances long before I ever changed my will, long before I was excluded from the wedding, long before I'd suspected anything at all. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I never imagined would cross my mind. Was my daughter simply drifting away from me, or had someone been quietly teaching her to see me as an inheritance instead of a father? I wish I could tell you that the answer became obvious after that. It didn't. If anything, the more I learned, the more determined I became not to jump to conclusions. I'd spent nearly 40 years negotiating contracts worth millions of dollars. One lesson had served me well in business and in life: patterns deserve attention, but assumptions can ruin good judgment. So instead of confronting Carolyn, I decided to do what Margaret would have done. I gathered facts. Daniel arranged a meeting with my accountant, Stephen Collins. Stephen had worked with Margaret and me for over 25 years. He knew every business I'd owned, every property I'd purchased, and every charitable donation we'd ever made. When I arrived, he already had several files spread across his conference table. "I've been reviewing your records," he said. "Find anything unusual? Not in your finances, then what in the requests?" He slid a legal notepad toward me. "I keep logs of every significant inquiry about a client's accounts. There were only 4 entries involving someone other than me over the previous 3 years. Each one had been declined. Each one had come from Carolyn." I looked at the dates. The first had been nearly 2 years earlier, long before the engagement, long before the wedding planning. What exactly was she asking for? Stephen adjusted his glasses. "The estimated value of your rental portfolio," I frowned, "and whether your charitable trust could be modified." "What else?" "The structure of your estate." I felt my stomach tighten. "Did she say why she said she wanted to better understand your long-term plans?" "Did you believe her?" "I believed she cared about you." That answer hurt because I believed it too. Stephen leaned forward. "Richer children ask financial questions all the time. I know most of the time there's nothing suspicious about it. But what concerns me isn't that she asked. It's how persistent she became after I explained. I couldn't answer on my drive home. I remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time. About a year earlier, Carolyn had insisted on photographing the inside of my safe. She'd claimed she wanted an inventory in case of fire or theft. Margaret used to keep jewelry there, along with deeds, insurance policies, and a few family heirlooms I'd refused politely if already got everything documented. Shed smiled. "I just worry about you living alone." At the time I'd appreciated the concern. Now I wondered whether concern had been the only reason. A week later, my neighbor Frank invited me over for coffee. Frank was 72, retired from the sheriff's department, and had the irritating habit of noticing things most people missed. He looked at me over his mug. "You've been quieter lately. I've had a lot on my mind." Wedding, I nodded. Had known Caroline since she was little. After I told him everything, he sat silently for almost a minute. Finally, he asked one question. "When was the last time your daughter wanted to spend time with you without talking about the future?" I blinked. "What do you mean? No wedding, no finances, no property, no planning, just you?" I searched my memory. A fishing trip 3 years ago. Christmas before that, helping me repaint the back porch after Margaret passed. Nothing recent. Not because every conversation had been about money, but because every conversation had become strangely practical, efficient, transactional. Frank nodded slowly when I couldn't answer. "Sometimes distance doesn't happen all at once. It happens one conversation at a time." That weekend, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of sitting at home feeling sorry for myself, I drove to the cemetery. Margaret always had fresh flowers. Always. I replaced the faded bouquet with white lily and sat on the small bench beside her headstone. "I don't know what I'm missing," I said quietly. "I keep feeling like I'm looking at a puzzle with half the pieces turned upside down." The breeze moved gently through the maple trees. "I don't want to believe our daughter has changed this much." I smiled sadly. "You'd probably tell me to stop talking and start listening." Margaret had always been better at hearing what people weren't saying. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Carolyn. "Hope you're doing okay. Wedding invitations have all been confirmed. Now everything's finally coming together." I stared at the screen. Not once did she acknowledge that her own father wasn't among those confirmations. Not once did she ask whether we could repair what had broken between us. I typed 3 different replies before deleting each one. Finally, I sent only "I'm glad your plans are coming together. I wish you both well." Her response was a simple heart emoji. Somehow that hurt more than silence. The following Tuesday, Daniel called. "Eve completed the revised estate documents. It'll come in tomorrow. There's one more thing." His tone immediately caught my attention. "What is it?" I had one of my associates review publicly available corporate filings connected to Emily's business, and we found a draft development proposal. I frowned. "For the land they bought?" "Yes." "What about it?" "The proposal included preliminary architectural plans, so they want to build a house." "Not just a house." He paused. "The estimated construction budget exceeded $6 million. I nearly laughed. "That's impossible. They couldn't qualify for that, not based on their current income." Exactly. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. Could the proposal have been speculative? Certainly, but developers usually don't spend tens of thousands on architectural planning unless they believe financing is realistic. I walked to my living room window. The afternoon sun stretched across Margaret's old garden. For years I'd believed wealth gave people security. Lately it felt more like it attracted expectations. The next morning I signed the new estate documents. The changes weren't dramatic on the surface. Carolyn remained a beneficiary, but the structure was completely different. Instead of receiving unrestricted control, most of the estate would now be placed in a professionally managed trust. The charitable foundation Margaret and I had discussed years earlier would receive a much larger share. Scholarships for trade students would become permanent. Several local organizations WED quietly supported would receive annual funding, and if any beneficiary attempted to interfere with my finances through deception, coercion, or unauthorized influence, their inheritance could be substantially reduced under carefully drafted provisions permitted by state law. Daniel watched me sign the final page. How do you feel? I thought for a moment. Peaceful, not angry, no regretful. Only that I didn't realize sooner that protecting a legacy isn't the same thing as withholding love. He smiled. I think Margaret would have approved. I hoped he was right as I gathered the signed documents. Neither of us knew that the wedding was now only 3 weeks away. And before those 3 weeks were over, someone would make a mistake so careless, so revealing that every lingering doubt I'd been struggling with would disappear in a single afternoon. 3 weeks before the wedding, I stopped by one of my rental properties to meet a contractor replacing several windows. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that usually passed without anything memorable happening. Around noon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar Chicago number. I almost ignored it. I'm looking for Richard Bennett. The woman said, "This is Richard. My name is Melissa." I hope I'm not overstepping, but I think you deserve to know something. My instincts immediately sharpened. What is this regarding friends with Emily's older sister? I said nothing. I recently learned you're not attending the wedding. That's correct. Another pause. I don't think you know why my heartbeat quickened. Listening, Melissa apologized several times before she continued. I was at Emily's bridal shower last weekend. All right, someone asked why the bride's future father-in-law wasn't invited. I corrected her gently. Her father, I'm sorry, yes. She sighed. Emily laughed. Laughed, she said. Inviting you would make things complicated because everyone would spend the reception trying to impress the millionaire. I remained silent. Then someone joked that it wouldn't matter after the inheritance anyway. My grip tightened around the phone. And Melissa hesitated, Emily said. She took a deep breath. Once everything is ours, none of this will matter for several seconds. I couldn't speak. Are you certain? I wish I weren't, she continued. I don't know your daughter well. But she didn't say those things. Emily did, and Carolyn, she looked uncomfortable. That surprised me. Did she agree? No. Did she disagree? Another pause. No, the answer hurt in a different way. Not because Caroline had spoken, because she hadn't. Melissa wasn't finished. There was something else. What Emily told everyone, you'd been difficult about your estate. I frowned. Difficult? She said you'd eventually come around. I never discussed my estate with her. I figured as much. She sounded genuinely upset. My father passed away 2 years ago. I know what losing a parent feels like. I couldn't keep quiet after hearing those conversations. I thanked her. When the call ended, I sat in my truck for nearly 15 minutes. Not angry, not even shocked, mostly sad. That evening I called Daniel. I think I finally understand. He listened quietly as I repeated every word Melissa had shared. When I finished, he asked only one question. Has Carolyn ever personally asked you for money? No. Has she ever threatened you? No. Then remember that distinction. He was right. Emily's words were cruel. Caroline's silence was painful, but they weren't the same thing. That mattered. The wedding came and went without me. I spent that Saturday volunteering at the trade school scholarship program. Margaret and I had supported for years. We interviewed apprentices entering electrical, plumbing, and roofing trades. One young man reminded me of myself at 19. Hardworking, nervous, grateful for every opportunity. Driving home that afternoon, I realized something. I hadn't thought about the wedding. Once in nearly 6 hours, healing, I discovered, doesn't arrive dramatically. It sneaks in while you're busy living. 2 months passed. Then one rainy October afternoon, someone knocked on my front door. It was Carolyn alone. She looked exhausted, older somehow. I invited her inside. Neither of us spoke until coffee was poured. Finally, she whispered, I made a terrible mistake. I waited. She stared into her cup. I kept telling myself avoiding conflict was easier. I know it wasn't. Tears rolled down her face. I should have stood up for you. Those words were the first honest thing I'd heard in months. I'm sorry. She cried openly now. I thought if I kept everyone happy, everything would work out. It rarely does. No. It usually just hurts everyone. She nodded. Then she told me everything. Emily had become increasingly obsessed with appearances. Bigger house, exclusive neighborhood, luxury vacations, private clubs. Every financial conversation eventually turned toward their future, whenever Caroline suggested slowing down, Emily insisted they were thinking long-term. At first, it sounded responsible. Eventually, it became constant. Questions about my investments, comments about my age, assumptions about what would eventually belong to them. Carolyn admitted she'd been uncomfortable for months. So why hadn't she stopped it? Her answer broke my heart. I kept thinking she'd changed. I recognized those words immediately. Because ID spent months saying the exact same thing about Carolyn. They separated less than 3 weeks later. The engagement didn't survive. Neither did Emily's carefully planned future. Without the inheritance, she'd quietly counted on. The ambitious construction project collapsed. The land was eventually sold, the LLC dissolved the following year. Life moved on, mine did too. Over the next 18 months, Carolyn and I rebuilt our relationship. Slowly, carefully, trust doesn't return because someone apologizes. It returns because their actions become consistently worthy of it. She came for Sunday dinners again, helped maintain Margaret's garden, volunteered with the Scholarship Foundation. Never once asked about my finances. Not once. Eventually I brought up the trust, I changed the estate plan. She smiled sadly. I assumed you had. Do you want to know what's in it? She shook her head. No, I've learned something. What I'd rather have my father than his money. For the first time in a very long while I believed her. 5 years later I attended another wedding. This time it was much smaller. No luxury ballroom. No extravagant decorations. Just family, close friends. And a quiet ceremony in the botanical gardens. Margaret had always loved Carolyn, married a kind history teacher named David. Before the ceremony began, she walked over and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. The first wedding I planned forgot what mattered. This one begins with the people who taught me what family actually means. Thank you for giving me the chance to become your daughter again. I love you, Dad. When the music started, she slipped her arm through mine. Together we walked toward the front. Not because the past had been erased, but because forgiveness had finally become stronger than regret. A year after that wedding, I updated my estate plan one last time. The trust remained, the Scholarship Foundation continued to grow. Local charities still received annual support. Caroline remained my primary beneficiary, not because she was my only child, but because she'd earned back something far more valuable than an inheritance. She'd earned my trust. Money can build houses. It can buy land, it can create comfort, but it cannot create character. Character reveals itself only when money is no longer the reason someone stays. And that's why, looking back, being told I wasn't invited to that first wedding became one of the greatest blessings of my life. If I had gone, I might never have seen the truth. If I hadn't quietly changed my 87 million will, I might never have protected the legacy Margaret and I spent a lifetime building. In the end, the greatest inheritance I left wasn't measured in dollars. It was the lesson that love and trust are gifts, never entitlements, and that real family is proven not by what they expect to receive, but by who they choose to be when there's nothing to gain.